In this video, I'm going to show you how easy it is to grow Snapdragons or Antirrhinums, same thing, from seed. I'm a home gardener and I'm busy enough that I don't want to waste time doing things that are unnecessary or unproductive, and I certainly don't want to waste my money on things that aren't going to grow. So I want to get the most bang for my buck, and therefore Snapdragons are a great flower to get good value out of the space it takes up in the garden. So whether you're an experienced gardener or just starting out, then follow along to see whether Snapdragons will be the perfect flower for you in your garden. So why grow Snapdragons? Could it be because the wide variety of colour they come in? Or could it because they have such a unusual flower head? Or maybe it's because they are a workhorse in the garden and every time you cut them they produce more flowers. Any one of those reasons would be a good reason for growing any plant. But to have all three in the same plant just makes it a no-brainer. Snapdragons will be in flower all season long. Once they start flowering, they will continue to flower as long as you continue to pick them. They have multiple varieties, so the flower heads are roughly the same, so they roughly form a spike of one form or another. So it's the petal shapes that are different. So some are open faced, some of the more traditional size that I don't know as a child whether you would have popped open the flower heads and it looks like a dragon opening, but that's essentially why they got the name. So they're more open and easily pollinated by the bees, or there are some that are double petaled, so they're more frilly, they have a longer flower head generally, but they're not as easy to pollinate, and that then means those particular flowers, those more difficult ones to pollinate, have a longer vase life. So as soon as they start to be pollinated by bees, they start to form a seed head, and therefore they have a shorter vase life. However, that said, that stem there will probably last a week in the vase, so it's worth keeping them for that. And the flower heads, the fact that they're a spike, really adds an extra dimension in any floral arrangement. So they are great to grow and should be on any cutting patch must-have list. The one thing that Snapdragons have going against them, so to speak, is that they are quite slow to mature. So they can take from 100 to 120 days, so 3 months to mature, which for an annual flower, that's quite a lot. However, in reality, they're a tender perennial, which is why they do take so long to get themselves established. However, the flowers in subsequent seasons are not quite as good, or you can't expect them to be quite as good, and the older the plant, the more susceptible it is to rust. So if you want good flowers every season, then you're better off treating your Snapdragons as an annual. They're actually a hardy annual, and therefore you can sow them in spring or autumn. If you're sowing them in spring, because they take so long to get going, then you need to start them about 10 weeks at least before the last frost, so that they can really get themselves established prior to going out into the garden, and then they start to get going. So you're really looking at an early start with Snapdragons. I personally prefer to start them in autumn so that you can get them going whilst the days are long, the weather's warm. They can form good seedlings that can then be planted out whether you plant them in the, or keep them in a greenhouse, or whether you plant them out, either will be fine. They don't need to be in a heated greenhouse once they've germinated or in a seedling form, unless you have particularly cold snaps. So unless it gets really cold, then it will withstand probably down to about -5. And we had more than that last year, actually. We were down to -13, I think, at some point, and they still survived for me. So, you know, you can err on the side of caution, but they're fairly hardy, and I'm going to plant them outside and just let them do their thing. And so that when spring comes, they are really, they've had the initial growth, and they then just will get going in earnest quicker than any spring sown flower. So for me, autumn sowing Snapdragons, and most hardy annuals in fact, are a good thing to do, and it means there's less to do in spring when the days are shorter. It is middle of August, and I am going to be sowing some Antirrhinums or Snapdragons. They take a long time, not necessarily a long time to germinate, but just a long time to grow. So I found it better to get them going over winter, and then they're just good to go once spring comes along. And obviously if they don't make it through the winter, you've got a second chance to sow some more in spring. But if you do sow them in spring, they do need to be sown early in spring, again, because of this long growth period it has from germination to getting a reasonable size plant. Now these are surface sown, and they are the tiniest seeds you are likely to get. So that's 4 seeds there. They are so tiny. And this Madam Butterfly series is actually quite expensive, so you don't really want to be wasting the seeds. You don't want to sow more than you really need. So I have a pinch, and what I'm going to do, I have used in the past a toothpick, and they pick up the seed, and I can then place it where I want to. This works well for some seeds and not for others. I don't know what it is about the seed, but it just helps you pick it up and get it exactly where you want to. And as I say, when it's an expensive seed, you don't want to be wasting them. This worked really well for me in the spring, but I seem to be having a challenge with it now, so I'm going to try and be really careful and pinch out one seed at a time. As I say, I've only got so much space, but equally I want enough plants to get a bit of a variety, so I'm going to try and half fill this tray with the seeds. Not quite sure how many there were there. There should be quite a few, more than enough. I have probably enough left to cover myself in the spring if we have any disasters. This tray will be, soil will be watered from underneath, which will then suck the seeds down onto the compost so they get a good contact with the compost. The compost has a bit of perlite in it to help with water retention. They're going to get planted out in about a month's time. So final thing, let's label it. And that's the same for all Snapdragons. Surface sow as finely as possible because they're so tiny seeds and they produce tiny plants until they really get established. So try and be as sparing as you can, otherwise you're wasting your seed. These are the Snapdragons that I sowed earlier. They are now 3 weeks into their life cycle. So those tiny seeds have become tiny seedlings. These seeds were sown nearly 3.5 months ago, so they are still taking their time. So I am also going to plant these out in the autumn and see whether I can get a good crop next year. Once your seedlings reach a certain height, then you can pinch them out. So in this instance, we've got a seedling that is 4 sets of leaves in height. So I would pinch it out at the second set of leaves. It can then grow on, and if you can see, there is another leaf set growing through there. So that will form a branch, and therefore you get more flowering stems. So you really can cut them hard back, but do let the plants grow to a reasonable size. These are autumn sown. It's September now, and I will be planting them in the garden. So actually that was done as an example, but I am not going to pinch out any more over winter. I'm going to let them stay as they are, and I shall pinch them in the springtime to let them branch out from that point on. I need them to have strong stems and not be susceptible to any cold, or they need to be strong to withstand the most of the winter that's coming. If you want to create even more plants for free, then you could take your pinched out tip and plant that into the soil, and you will get another plant. So just create a hole, push it in, remove, if there's too many leaves, just remove the leaves, and then continue to water as you normally would, and they will grow and produce flowers for you in the same way that the normal plants would. So again, you don't need to oversow your seeds. You have got plenty of options for propagating on these plants. Once the plants are big enough to be planted out, then you just need to plant them out about 20 centimetres apart. So we have 3 Antirrhinums planted out in a row in a 1 metre wide bed. So they grow, the more you cut them, as I say, the more you cut them, the more branches they produce. So they become quite wide as well as tall. So they do take up a bit of space, and they are also geotropic, which means that they will go towards the gravity. So if I take a close-up of this branch here, so this plant is growing towards the ground, and then it started coming upwards. So all of the stems that are cut off that main branch have now started to come up, but the initial plant was quite a small, probably too small a plant to plant out, so the stems weren't thick enough to keep them upright. And they are also heading towards the light, which is coming from that direction. So they have all tended to grow that way. So you do need a bit of space. When you think of how they start and how small they are, then it's surprising how big these plants can get. The ideal time to harvest the blooms is when they are 1/3 to 1/2 open. So this one here is fully open. Well, there are a few left at the top, but I would say that's fully open. So really, it's not going to have a very long life in the vase at all. This one here is probably erring on just about right, maybe just slightly over, because it's still got some buds forming, but it's got some open. So this is, out of those 3, that one is the better one for the most to pick, but that one will continue to open up as the days go on in a vase, but this one will be over with really quite quickly. So to make a cut, So we need to go right down to the base, and it is worth cutting it as close as possible. So I am going to leave maybe 2 sets of leaves on this stem here, and there we have it. Cut. Now I've cut this in the middle of the day when it's quite sunny, or certainly quite warm here in the UK. Ideally you would be cutting them when it's cooler, so first thing in the morning, last thing at night, and then position them in a dark room so that they can condition in water properly. So this needs to be plonked into water straight away and kept in a dark room until you're ready to use it, so that that light will not distort the stems too much. As you can see, the stem that I picked was really quite bendy. I've had a shocking time with my staking this year, so that's mine. If you stake it properly, it will be straighter. And if the light is good and if all things considered, then it will be a better stem. Unfortunately, I've not really paid much attention this year and everything's gone a bit haywire. Because they bend with the light, when you first pick them, they need to be kept in a tall vase or wrapped in brown paper to keep them, and in a vase, to keep them as straight as possible. If you're wanting to sell them to florists or professionally, then they do need to be straighter than my sad attempt, and storing them wrapped in paper will keep those stems straight whilst they are still being conditioned. I hope I've convinced you that snapdragons are an essential flower for the cutting patch. Certainly I find them invaluable. If you're wanting good flowers for display purposes or selling, then it's best to treat them as an annual. And they are a hardy annual, so you can sow them in the autumn and leave them, and they will come up smiling in the spring. If you are interested in growing these snapdragons, then I have a few on the website, a few seeds on the website that you can sow now and get you ready for your flowering season next year. Take a look at the link below or use the QR code at the side and we can grow these together.